Welcome to Sacred Conversations, a place where Dr. Nicole Dolan and I, Robin Bethel, along with a myriad of guests, explore some of the sacred threads and wholeness of life, held within the light and within the dark, held within the immensity. Thank you for being with us. This week, Nicole and I share conversation with Andrew Monroe Rice, a novelist, a poet, and a spiritual mentor. Andrew has moved through addiction and recovery, sacred life passages and descents, and experiences within men's work that broke him wide open. Here, he shares notes from a complex, beautiful life and journey that also touch on his experience as a man, and specifically his time first opening into and later helping facilitate men's rites, that is, RITES, and a sacred container of community that changed his life. We hope you enjoy listening.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi.
And welcome, Andrew.
Hi.
Thank you for being with us today on Sacred Conversations.
Pleasure.
Yes, so nice to have you. I want to also just start off by saying I'm a little bit sick right now, so sorry if you hear any coughs or sniffles and things, but I'm so excited to speak with Andrew, who is someone that I became familiar with on Instagram through his poetry a few years ago. And I was so struck by its beauty, and I bought a couple of his books, and I've just enjoyed him as artist ever since. I know he has such a rich, wide, luminous story and journey, and I thought it'd be so lovely to speak with him here. So thank you, Andrew, and we'd love if you would just begin by giving us an introduction to who you are and however feels right to you.
Great. Yeah, really wonderful to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Yes.
Well, I'm sitting in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. That's where I live. I was born and raised here, but I left. Well, I was sent away to I was sent away to boarding school after my first year of high school, essentially to sort of get my act together. And it actually ended up working and helping a lot. In some ways, got me out of a family situation that was pretty chaotic. So I was getting sent away from being in trouble, but in reality, that break from some of the family trauma ended up helping me. So different places, college, graduate school, and work, but then made my way back here, 20, 23, 24 years ago. Got married and have two boys, the youngest of whom just graduated from high school. So we're empty nesters here in a couple of months. And I've done a variety of work and been called in different directions. I got sober when I was 20 years of age. My mom had struggled with mental illness and addiction. And then my older brother, and I were pretty sort of out there acting out in our teen years. And then I followed both of them into recovery. And that was a big turning point for me. And the reason why I bring it up is that sort of got me much more interested in issues of spirituality and my interior life, though very young. And so I went off to theological school and, traveled in Asia, but then sort of took a career path that took me away from that. And now I'm 52 years old, and the last 4 or 5 years I've made my way back to sort of writing and retreat work. I think was sort of sparking inside of me back then, but wasn't quite ready to do it. I needed to go off on my first half of life, sort of ambitious journey. So I've come full circle here with my vocational work in the last 5 or 6 years, and it's been beautiful to be able to do that.
Thank you. Can I circle back and also ask you, I feel like that was a lovely introduction to who you have been in the world and also who you are in the world because of these things inside of you. But could you drop even a layer deeper and maybe speak to who you feel like you are in terms of like a soul here?
Yeah, I think there's been a bit of a struggle. Maybe we all have that, just as humans, between sort of the true self or the soul, more soulful part of yourself, and then the sort of pressures of the world, the requirements that maybe a lot of us have put on us in our roles. And so, in the deeper level, a caregiver, sort of more of a tender connector. I'm a 2 on the Enneagram. If you're
Mhm.
if that's has any significance for anybody. And so it's been a bit of a tussle and a sort of a moving in and out of those roles. Sometimes I've been able to conjoin them with what I sort of am doing, but I think that in particular, like with my writing, that was not something I had a lot of intentions in my life about. I want to go achieve this sort of like, power boat, like point the boat where you want to go and rev it up and, very sort of masculine, ambitious, Um, but writing, it was never one of those. I tried it a bit when I was younger and it was very difficult. Like it just didn't work. Just what was coming out didn't feel it started coming to me, and particularly after this experience that I had in 2019, going through a men's rite of passage, a very deeply transformative, sort of breaking me wide open in a deeper, soulful way. And the writing really, and that's not an uncommon thing, actually. A lot of the men I've gotten close to in that work over the last 6 years, many of them, particularly poetry, not only didn't write poetry prior to that, but didn't even read it and then found themselves expressing themselves, trying to express themselves with poetry. So I think liking to be in community, just like the three of us are in community, and around vulnerability and around that sort of deeper meaning that I hope to brush up against in my life. That's sort of more of who I am than the sort of surface roles. Yeah.
Very cool. Thank you for sharing. And I don't know if you know, but I'm a depth psychologist. So
Okay. Yeah.
my first time actually getting to sit with a poet, which is really exciting and wonderful, besides Robin, of course, but her deep love for poetry has brought me into a love kind of learning, leaning into for it. And so it's
Mm.
really nice. And I can only imagine how excited she is to have you here too. And I really hear those depth and artistic themes in your life as you're sharing, the things that have been catalysts for growth and
Mm.
transformation. And also we've talked a lot about here too. So what came up and what I was thinking about is this idea that as we do our healing work, we start to really open up spiritually, like something starts to open up and give us access to not only something deeper in here, but maybe even a connection or even a vocation potentially. So, something that we like to ask here is for you to tell us or take us through a sacred arc or story of your life.
Yeah. When I saw that in the email, I started to ruminate, and man, the first thing that came up was some gratitude of just the experiences that I've been able to encounter. Some through my own falling apart, some through just life happening, and sometimes putting myself in a position. Um, I guess maybe I'll tell two stories that were symbolic at the time for where I was sort of transitioning in my life. So, in college, studied abroad a little bit in what first semester in Sri Lanka and was studying Buddhism and had a really powerful experience. It was mostly academic. There was obviously like a cultural immersion component to it that was really powerful. But I went back over to that region after I got out of college to work a bit before I went to graduate school and worked in Sri Lanka and was headed to India to meet someone. But I had read an article about a place in Thailand that was intriguing to me while I was over there. And so I decided I had a little bit of extra money. I was being sponsored by some friends and family to do this work. I wasn't paid. And I went to Thailand and ended up finding what was this place, which was a former Buddhist monastery that had sort of unplanned been transitioned into being an AIDS hospice. And that's because this one monk who was there had been going to Bangkok for his official duties. And this is when the AIDS epidemic was really starting to explode. This was 1994. No, wait, probably 96, 97. And there were a lot of people struggling and suffering from the disease of HIV and AIDS. It had no resources. Hospitals didn't really know how to handle them, or there was a lot of fear. So he started to bring people who were really sick and not doing well back with him to this monastery about 2 hours outside the city. And frankly, what happened is a lot of the monks started leaving and more people started coming. Long story short, it started to get resources and money to care for these people, hospice work. So I just wanted to, I don't know, I had this idea of maybe I'd go write about it. This was in my period of wanting to sort of write, but not know how to do it. And have an experience. Well, ultimately, what happened is I was asked to help. They needed people to help volunteer, and so they started training me in basic things like caring for patients. I remember there was an analgesic sort of cream that a lot of patients needed for pain, and cleaning up the hospice and being with people. And it was a very like profound experience for me. It wasn't really what I intended to do. And I remember distinctly one night being asked by this doctor there to come over to the bedside of this young Thai man who was probably about my age. I mean, I was in my early to mid 20s, and he was a former sex worker for part of the tourism, probably still to this day, of European men and women that coming over. And his mother was there, and we were with him when he died, and it was a very beautiful. It was a sad occasion, of course, about the circumstances of his death, but the spiritual, emotional sort of moment there and observing him transition was I'd never been through that, and so that stuck out somehow in my memory. One is because as I'm approaching, the end of my work years here in the next, I don't know, 10 years or so. I'm going to get certified as an end of life doula to try to have that as an option for work, looking for more structure in my life and such. And it really started in that moment of recognizing that yearning to sort of comfort and and aid as a companion, which is what a doula is. So that was a real turning point for me, and I'm even asking questions like, "Well, should because I was going to go to Harvard Divinity School the next year, and I had all these sort of ambitious ideas. And I thought maybe I should be a nurse because that's essentially what I was doing there. The other moment was I went through a big midlife struggle with career and lots of things about 8 years ago. Decided to leave a series of sort of desk jobs in the nonprofit world, which I used to be a state senator also years ago. So I would get sort of recruited for these sort of nonprofit jobs. I don't know, frankly, and this is not false humility. I don't know if I was that good at them, to be honest, about what they really entailed. I think I was attractive for some of those roles because I was a former politician and I knew people and could give a speech but ultimately with a lot of what the job required, I wasn't that great at it and I didn't really enjoy it. But was doing my best and ultimately um, decided I wanted to write. And this sort of idea for a novel was bubbling up in me around family history and decided to take a break. My wife said, yeah, I make plenty of money for us to live on. And so that year that I was writing, I went off and did this men's rites of passage with an organization called Illumin, which is sort of a play on illuminate and man. It's a men's sort of interior soul work organization co-founded by Richard Rohr, pretty well-known spiritual writer, Franciscan monk. So going through that experience was a huge life change for me. But there was a moment, it's a 5-day immersion, and we don't typically talk a lot about what goes on in men's rite of passage. One, because it's very difficult to convey. It's a very deeply soulful experience, and it's hard to put words to. And two, for men that may be thinking about doing it, for it to be really fully initiatory, you don't really want them to have much of an idea of what they're going to experience, frankly. A lot of guys will be like that. And some guys won't sign up because of that. I mean, it's not like we don't reveal anything, but we sit in council, there's silence work, there's deep soul work and ritual. But each day in the middle of this, so it's a 5-day immersion, your phones are gone for the 5 days, you don't have access to them. And this was in the Texas Hill Country. And for the second, third, and fourth days leading up to the initiatory, the rites, in the afternoon, as the large group, you're often off in your small 5 to 6 member council. But as a large group, you hear an elder teaching. And there's 3 elders there, and they'll teach on a different topic. And this was about halfway through the rites, and there was a man named Steve who told his story, his sacred journey story, like you're talking about with me. And I was already, you have to remember, a lot of things were already sort of at work with us. I mean, the use of poetry, the use of counsel, the involvement in ritual. It was really a deep dive. And so I was quite sort of churned up in a good way, and in a way that was really, I didn't have control, which is one of the powers of men's work, because men sort of can get overloaded in that archetype of maybe the warrior, just sort of resisting and trying to control and using sort of force and power rather than softening more of the masculine archetype of the lover. So as he spoke and told his story and talked about graduating from high school with his lifelong buddy, they played football together. They were going to maybe go play in junior college during the Vietnam War, and how he had somehow avoided getting drafted and his buddy didn't, and how his buddy never came home from the war, and then getting married and a lot of the sorrow and a joy with having children and health problems with the children. The story just really, and I could really resonate deeply with the loss of his friend, because my brother was killed when he was 31 and I was in my late 20s. He worked in the World Trade Center and was killed when it was attacked. So I just deeply impacted me. And there was an elder who sat up with the leadership or the facilitators, or we call the weavers or ritual elders during these times. And he just sat there and he was silent throughout the whole 5 days, other than he would often end the afternoon session with a poem
Mm,
that he had memorized by heart. So I'm already just quite cracked open and just feeling deeply connected to this man, Steve, and just brushing up against something that I'd never really felt within myself that was happening to me. And then the man sitting next to him, named Terry, the elder, recited The Journey by Mary Oliver, which is a really a quite profound poem. I think, one of the best 5 poems I've ever read. Used a lot in men's work. And that was it. The dike broke. And I'd cried, of course, in my life before, out of sorrow, out of happiness, out of pain. And it just was sort of this watering. I felt like it was like a cistern of just water that came up. I mean, I sat there. Everybody, I think, moved on to what was next, lunch or whatever. And I sat there for probably half an hour by myself and just let the watering happen. I guess is the only way I can explain it. And it was a beautiful moment where I felt like something had shifted in me, and it was never going to be the same. Doesn't mean all the issues of which I struggled with were going to be resolved, or that I wasn't going to have life. But there was something deeply soulful that, even as I explain it right now, just doesn't feel adequate to explain. Right. And so that's another sacred moment. And it took the willingness to go somewhere and to embark on something that I didn't really know what it was, but I felt drawn to it, and to let the experience happen. A lot of it was sort of scary in some ways, of the exposing yourself in the ways that we are asked to, emotionally. I mean, it's not a depth psychology immersion, but there's a lot of ways in which it relates to that. Bill
Absolutely.
Plotkin's a depth psychologist that does a lot of similar work with all genders, right? So Illumin and Animus Valley, Bill Plotkin's group, has a lot of similarities as well. We use nature as a template. So those are two of these moments that I really look back on that help steer me in a way, sort of life happening to me rather than me deciding what I'm going to do with life.
mm. Thank you. And is that second experience that you were talking about, did you say that happened about, is that when you said about 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, or
Yeah, it was in September of 2019 is when I did the
okay.
men's rights, and the couple of years leading into that was when I was just sort of bumping up against a lot of dead
Mm,
ends. It seemed like, not quite getting the
yeah.
satisfaction with my work that I had hoped. I gleaned a lot of, so Richard Rohr, who I mentioned, has a book, Falling Upward, that a lot of men and women, very resonant with women too, of course, but a lot of men who get involved in the men's work have read it, and it pulls them there. It's sort of this idea of the two halves of life, spirituality. So the first half of life, in some ways, particularly for men, who have this sort of masculine Peter Pan sort of element of their development that hopefully they grow out of, right? Um, that is about to be important and make their mark on the world. And in our men's work, we don't really caution against that when we work with young men. And I lead a program in our organization for youth and their fathers, uncles, grandfathers in the summer in Colorado. We tell them to go do that. It's important to go do that, to go try that. Because in some ways you need to sort of achieve or not achieve what you think, or achieve or not achieve it, but sort of see that even when you achieve what you set out to do to sort of make your mark in the world, that it still leaves you wanting in this more deeply soulful way. So a lot of those things were fizzling out for me in my mid 40s. And all in my role as a father, it didn't have quite the intensity when they're little and you're putting them on your shoulders and you're so involved in their, right, you're coaching them play soccer. And as they moved into adolescence and middle school and high school and they started to distance, particularly boys, I have 2 boys. So a lot of those intensities and meaning, the things I was getting meaning from, were all sort of falling away. And so that was when the door, and then crises within my marriage, within myself, grief. I'll say that a lot of the men's work and that rights and that we do just within all of our work is, as Stephen Jenkinson, who I love, says, that is grief is a tool. And a lot of the work that we do is grief work, not just around death and loss of death, but around a lot of the losses that start to happen in midlife. You age physically, you're not as strong or healthy as you once were. Often your marriage, if you're still married to the person that you married before, is not the same marriage, even if you're still married. Often you're on your second or third iteration of trying to sort of figure out what it looks like when the sort of romance period fizzles out. And so there's lots of endings and sort of lost feelings of sort of feeling lost. Where do you turn? Particularly of the men who are sort of pulled towards that work. And so that a lot of that was what was going on for me in the 3 or 4 years leading up to that rites in September 2019.
When did you start writing poetry? Because I'm trying to remember when I collided with one of your poems. I feel like it might have been around
Probably a
2000.
year or two later that you did, yeah. I was
Yeah.
writing this novel that year that I did the men's rights, and I had an editor that I was working with, and I gave her the version of the manuscript we were at around that time. Said, I'm going to go off and do this. She said, that's great. That'll give me 2 or 3 weeks to sort of work on it and just take a time out. So great. So I came back from this experience, and we were on a call, and I said, oh my gosh, I had the most profound experience. And she goes, really? And I was like, it's very difficult. And this is something that's very common that men come back and they want to tell their partner or best friend. And you get like a couple minutes into trying to explain it and you can't. It's really hard. And they were sort of like, what? And she said, well, maybe you should try to write a poem about it. I'd never written poetry. I think maybe I tried, but
Hmm.
nothing came of it. So I said, okay. And my writing muscles were sort of activated and well honed from all this writing in the novel, which is a lot of volume writing when you're trying to write a novel. I think the final book came out to be about 100,000 words, but I probably wrote 140,000 words. So 40,000 words or so had been sort of stripped out. And so there's a lot of getting material in there. So anyway, I wrote a poem and I read it to her the next time we had a call, and she said, oh, that's great. And so I just started doing more of it. And then it really, yeah, just sort of opened up from there. And as I took my post rights work into doing council work, both sitting in council and stoking council, and then I helped start a group in prison that's about an hour away, a men's prison. And so I started going there twice a month to lead council. And the more that I did that sort of continued community work around soul work, the poetry started flowing more and more. So yeah, Robin, I think I remember, and I wrote a lot in COVID. The book, my novel came out like, 2 weeks into the shutdown, COVID. I
Yeah.
think we did get one book reading in before we all couldn't be around each other. But
Mhm.
then I wrote a lot of poetry in 2020, 2021. So it's probably sometime in that period that we got connected over Instagram through
Yeah.
through poetry. Yeah.
Yeah. I kind of want to pepper some poetry throughout.
Yeah.
And so, since it's the first poem I came across, and then I'm not sure where it falls into your own personal journey, but would you please read Staying Power?
Yeah. Yeah. I've got it here. Let's see. And actually, I wrote it several years ago, but I guess I hadn't put it in. It was in a journal, which was great. But I think that's one reason why I was delayed putting it in one of my collections. But it's in my most recent collection, Years at Home. So yeah, it's titled "Stay in Power." To what length will you risk digging your heels and loud mind into the terror of the naked now? It is indeed endless, with no walls to lean up against. But you just can't see. I am there too, gazing your way with my caring eyes. Both of us ready for the moon to backdive into western curtains and the glow of hope warming us, inviting us to stay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just have to say, as I'm listening to you, I mean, thank you for everything that you're sharing. There's so much beauty in what you're sharing. I'm more feeling into what you're sharing, to be honest. And I've heard you say a couple of times, like, I don't think I know how to explain that or put that into words. And I just really feel and even invite people who are listening. And this is true for poetry too, but even in your words energetically, you can really feel what it is that you're sharing. It's incredibly rich, the journey that you've been on, and you give such beautiful examples too, I feel like, of like you said, like letting life lead you. And really in the beginning, I feel like you were talking about, some catalysts that brought you to the next stage, whether it was a surrender then or a following, like even being sent to boarding school, right? It's just like
Yeah, I was a bad kid. Yeah.
I write a lot about meaning and coming into
Mhm.
that meaning through that wholeness, that journey. And so I really hear like those catalysts that brought you to these places, whether they were wanted or not, that brought things, to the next stage. And then when you started really healing and opening, then you started really listening, leaning
Mhm.
in, following. And as you did, I mean, you can just hear such a deep soul calling in everything that you do. So I want to share that. I mean, thank you. And also, I can really feel what it is that you are sharing. I think you are explaining it well as we can, and I think that that's a lot of what we do on this podcast is we're trying to share things that aren't always easy to put into words. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I try to brush up again. Thank you for that. Yeah, in the men's work, when we're in council, we all have a word we use to sort of as an affirmation when someone's done speaking, and it's here, and that we use it in the two ways it's spelled. So HEAR, like I hear you, and I'm with you, I see you, and then also HERE, like I'm here with you.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
felt that in your feedback, your reflection back.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm also really curious, if you don't mind us kind of tapping into this death doula. It sounds like
Yeah.
the next, soul opening stage of life in ways. And I haven't shared this openly a whole lot, but I'm somebody who energetically and spiritually walked my father home.
Mm.
And what I will say about it that was really fascinating, and I'd just be curious if it brings anything up for you, is I don't know if you've heard of this idea. So we've heard near death experience, of course. But what happened after I had this experience with my dad is I felt like I was in a bit of, I did a lot of this through dream work, but I felt like I was sleeping for a couple of weeks. And when I woke up, let's say, I had an email in my inbox that said, "Have you ever heard of the shared death experience?"
Mm.
And I read through it and it was just, it was validation, it was confirmation if I needed any. Like there was this guy who was presenting on it like the next day in Santa Barbara. So I listened to him talking about it. And there were very specific, like archetypal, or you could even just say like steps of the journey that people who had shared death experiences experience. So I don't know if you're familiar with this at all, and we don't even we'll see, we don't have to go there, we might not, but either way it really sparked something in me when you shared that, because it was like, yeah, I never intended to, but I've had what I would consider a little bit of a death doula experience.
Wow, what a beautiful opportunity or that you had to be able to have that with your father.
Yeah.
Um, I see that a little bit in my family as my wife and I merge, in definitely well into the second half of life, and the grandparents of my kids are dying, and those are getting near the end, and how some of them are just not really wanting to talk about it, you
Hmm.
know. So I think some of what's drawing me to it is what a looming thing it is for me, and how I see it figures into a lot of where I'm focused and what scares me, but also intrigues me about sort of what is meaningful or not for me in this stage of my life, my time here. I've been influenced a lot by Joseph Campbell. I love that idea that eternity is now. There's really no beginning or end to this. There are these transitions between how we experience it and what body we're in or form we take. But a little bit of what you're explaining, I read about this book that a friend recommended, The Grace and Dying by Kathleen Dowling Singh. She was a hospice worker for 40 years. She writes a lot about that. She makes the distinction that you were talking about. She makes that distinction between a near death experience that someone may have, or you may witness someone have, but then the sort of the spiritual experience of dying. So the part of the book that I've been reading recently, she's talking about that sort of that period of sort of the dissolving into something larger that the dying person starts to surrender into, and then being accompanied and them in that or witnessing that and seeing it so many times. It was, yeah, this similar stuff to what you're talking about. Yeah, I think as of right now, I mean, definitely been influenced by studying a lot of Stephen Jenkinson. So if you're not familiar with him, I wasn't familiar with him until a couple of years ago. But yeah, there's just a lot there that really got my attention. The videos on him, he wrote a book called Die Wise, but he has this theory that he was a former hospital chaplain, worked within the sort of death and dying trade, he calls it. But he would get hired to come speak to these palliative care conferences, people who were with the dying, and he often would sort of rankle them with his opinions about, like, he'd say, well, true or false, everybody knows they're going to die, and everybody would raise their hand, and he said, not really. We don't really live in a way that fully understands, that really allows it and includes it in the life experience, that loves it as much as that. When you love someone, you shouldn't just love the things that are easy to love and the beginnings and the middles, but you have to love the end,
Hmm.
because everything you love will end. this house I'm in, that my dog sleeping outside in the hallway, my marriage, myself, my children, it all ends. And so he just has a lot of this sort of stuff that really then gets applied to a lot more than just our physical death that we all will experience. It gets applied to a lot more about day to day deaths and rebirths. And that's a lot of what we do in the men's work, is sort of this idea of what needs to die and then be turned out of that, sort of made from that. And then I think also what you were talking about in a little bit of a reflection, seeing what life intends to do with me and that work. We also have some humble awareness in our circle work that we do, that we're going to move in and out of those seasons. There's going to be times where we're very centered in that. And then, as goes with sort of the ego and getting sort of focused on pleasure or the avoidance of pain or whatever, sort of pull back out into the world in which we live and get off center from that. And so there's a little bit of a crisis sometimes when I mentor men that are earlier in the process, and they sort of had this really deeply connected feeling coming out of a rites or something. And then it starts to sort of wane a month or two later and say, well, that's normal. We can't really stay in that liminal space forever. We're sort of trying to incorporate that and bring that back to our job and our relationships and our families and whatever it may be. And there's no perfect way to sort of keep that. That's why the continuous sort of work, sort of be reopening ourselves to it, is so important, to sort of come back home to ourselves. But yeah, I'm very excited. And I also, frankly, I'm not really ending the work I've been doing. The writing either sort of comes to me or not. I do some retreat work involving the Lumen, but my younger son leaving, I'm a little spooked by the extra free time that I'm going to have. And I thought, what I hope to do with the end of life doula certificate is maybe be in a situation where I'm working with a team, where I've got some more structure. A lot of my work sometimes is isolated. And so to be able to not have to go out and hustle clients, so to speak, for a retreat I want to host or a vision quest I want to lead, but to be part of being employed, which it's been a while. So.
Yeah. I feel like you're really discussing too, just with that arc, the psycho-spiritual journey of those of us who do go into conscious alignment with self. Now that sounds really loaded, but
Yeah.
I think that there is a period of time, certainly as a poet, a writer, this, right? Somebody who goes deeper into soul work, there is a period of time where we really do go on a very isolated journey. There really
Yeah.
just is that time. And then there becomes a desire later to come back into community and
Yeah.
connection. Mm-hmm.
Hard to stay there forever. And I think prior to the rights experience, I struggled with being alone. There was more loneliness in my solo time. And that work pushed me into a deeper solitude. And COVID helped in that way. I mean, COVID was deeply tragic for the world. I'm not trying to, but not being able to, and a lot of the stuff that I was just, the prison group that I told you about that I had just gotten going, it got shut down for a year. There was no Zoom that they could get on with me in prison. And so a lot of my work just got shut down. And that's another reason I wrote a lot of poetry. I was at home a lot. That's why I named this last collection Years at Home. Literally, I had years at home.
I saw that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but it did, I started to recognize in hindsight, which is a lot of times I think how we see our growth is looking back in the rearview mirror, like that my nurturing or experience with solitude increased, that I was able to find more solitude in my alone time than loneliness, which are very different things. But I think you're totally right. You reminded me of a quote with what you just said, with Howard Thurman, who was a really fascinating theologian. He has this quote that say that in every person there is a sea, and within every person, within that sea is an island, and on that island is an altar, and standing before that altar is an angel with a flaming sword. And nothing gets past that angel with the flaming sword without your consent. And what's on that altar is your inner authority. It is the inner authority of knowing the true self, that self-alignment you're talking about, that soul alignment, that I am being me, essentially. I'm not acting out of some obligation in a family role, or I'm not having sort of a way in which my wound sort of dictates how I try to make up for my low self-esteem or whatever. All these ways we can sort of wear these masks, either knowingly or unknowingly, but that you're really embodied in your life meaning and who you are. And if there's that angel with the flaming sword guarding that, well, sometimes the angel takes a nap, sometimes, there's the ability to sort of perfectly hone that and always sort of be in line with that altar. I just don't think it's possible. I've done it plenty of times as far as beating myself up for having, in the recovery world, there's an old along sort of saying, oh, I got off the beam, and sort of the beam of balance. And there are some times where you get off the beam because you become undisciplined or lazy in your spiritual practices, or you latch onto resentment that you really don't want to let go of, and it sort of tanks you for a month, or whatever. You start drinking again. It's your fault. Is what I'm trying to say. There's plenty of times where you get knocked off the beam by no fault of your own at all. Life happens. You know, we have winter. Winter is inevitable. We come back to winter, and there's a spring, and there's a summer. So I think that's been a real eye-opening thing for me, and I try to impart in my companionship work is to say, allow yourself the grace of imperfection, and that even though you may go have a deeply soul-aligned experience, or a month, or a year, it's a lucky thing to have that a whole year of that. There's gonna be impermanence, right? This too shall pass, and you'll
Right.
sort of fall apart again. Yeah, you'll see typically maybe you don't fall apart as much as you used to, or as
Yeah.
dramatically, or the falling apart period is quicker, and we sort of regather ourselves into sort of a resurgence. So that's one of the biggest things I've seen that's so necessary in this work, particularly with men, is for them to go easier on themselves. And a lot of my poetry, I think, reflects that came up a lot in when I look over what I've written, sort of a need for more of a tenderness and self forgiveness.
Hmm. Do you have a
Yeah,
poem around that in mind that you would like to share right now?
yeah, pick some. It's hard to know. Um, what did I choose here? Oh, this is an interesting one. Yeah. So yeah, this was back in 2020.
What book is this
It's
in, Andrew?
this is in Jung at the Unraveling. So that's sort of a mysterious title, but these poems, I feel like I really got into studying a lot of Carl Jung and tried to really be not just within myself autobiographically. I mean, a lot of my poetry is autobiographical, but not all of it is. Some of it, I have a whole collection of is really more sort of universal things that I've noticed about people that I'm interact with and I'm close to in the world and about life and humanity. But this one, I really tried to sort of crack open a little bit of the shadow and stuff that isn't always easy to write about. There's some poetry in here that you're like, huh, that's sort of hard to read out loud or something. But this is called Unraveling. My wife suggested, requested, I write some poems that aren't so sad. For the lake cabin, something carefree to lay around. Who wants their weekend away knocked sideways with gray? But isn't the daily visit from sorrow gorgeous in her own right? I know that is an offensive question, but it wells up in me like nausea. Who knew life would be brimming with so many endings? The answer is pretty much everyone in due time. And I'm embarrassed by this heartbreak until my pen releases it and the lump under my Adam's apple softens. I make big, sharpie red circles around these moments. And then I appear to me, wrinkled and tired, invisible in the reflection of the glass front door of my future. He isn't coming in from the rain. I must go out to follow my heart anew.
Hmm. Thank you.
So I think that's where sort of these sort of the mini deaths, the grief,
Hmm.
the tool of grief of when
Hmm.
life doesn't really deliver what you thought it promised,
Hmm.
or things were delivering, things were wonderful in some way, and then they end. you
Hmm.
know, those things. There's the hope of something, and then there's the actualization and getting a good run from something.
Can I ask you to also read, I feel like that connects a little bit to that desert lesson?
Yes, I think I know where that
It's in
is. Let's see.
luminosity.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and this was the archetype of the desert, the openness of it, the template of the desert to be sort of this boundless landscape. There's some quote, that Wendell Berry's got a quote that the spiritual journey is the journey of 1 inch. It's sort of 1 inch forward, but thousands of feet deep. And there's that opportunity in the desert to really sort of, to not lose yourself in the distractions of beauty and activity and color. It's particularly desert in the winter, just sort of that open, endless landscape. And then that was the location of the desert fathers and mothers of, Near Eastern Christianity to sort of leave the world of noise and attachment in a very Buddhist way and to go out into the desert to go in. And so one of the famous desert fathers quotes by Abba Moses was a student coming with a big question about life, and he's telling the student, "Go to your cell, like your prison cell, and it will teach you everything you need to know." And those sort of things really resonated in my prison work. the desert father's work. Okay. Desert lesson. Abba promises us, don't stop breathing. Each sweep of it takes you closer than close to yourself. That way you can keep pace with your lament as she serenades your great healing. Abba knows, he says, parent your fear and always forgive, always. In that way, the sacred willingness cannot escape you, chasing your ego's fear. Abba says, cry the full sadness of your precious life in this life. Do this so you will not have to carry it through eternity, feeling lost from God. That is the worst sin of all, quote unquote, sin. Then you will know the full grace and beauty resting deep inside the seed at the very own center of your very own grief. Abba says, accept yourself as small, insignificant, so you can fall into the peace you have always dreamed of. Do this even if, especially if, your surroundings are overcome with doubt. There is no exit, and you are empty of all admiration. Don't retreat. Fear is a trick. Your proud certainty, a trick. Both will paralyze your simple spirit, even the intelligent wanderer, especially the genius. Keep sitting, breathe. You are in this desert to mourn and conquer what the world of noise and allure won't allow you to. So it's a bit of a vision fast theme, right? To sort of pause from the life of attachment and the life that we have to live and to go somewhere to really face the naked now, the power of the now, that staying power talks about. So lots of themes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Lots of themes that come up, particularly when you write, I think like I do, which is just to sort of see what comes up. So there's a lot of, not in a bad way, but a lot of redundancy, a lot of the same stuff coming up, right?
Yeah, not at all in a bad way. It's just these themes that are asking to be with.
And it's also very, it's teachable to the writer, I think. Like one of the things we do in recovery work is inventories. Like in the 12-step programs, you have the 4-step inventory and the 10-step inventory. And there's some misunderstanding of that for sure, the 4-step inventory, there's an element of getting things out that have never been shared, that are shameful or painful. But that's not really the point of it. Like in a confessional Catholic sense, that's not really the point of the inventories. The point of the inventory is to find threads of regularity, patterns.
Mm.
Oh, when I get scared about being rejected, I use anger to push people away. And I do that in this situation. Oh, and I do that there. And you see, the more you see the same threads, you see it's really significant, right? This is something to teach me, right? So I think that the writing has been that way for me, given that I didn't really plan it, and I'm not necessarily like a professional who like makes a big living on or anything, but I see it in that the use in a useful way to say, oh, look at what keeps coming up. And when I really just let it flow, look at these certain things keep coming up, and that's useful for me to understand what is like you both have talked about what's coming from a deeper place. I'm not really choosing it. Like I'm gonna sit down and write a poem about grief today, or about love, or loss. Like, this is what wells up if we allow for it.
I was thinking, I know staying power, and then when you were talking about wanting to get an end of life doula certification, and that it made me think of that too, in kind of a different way. But I was just thinking, I think Marianne Williamson used this language, but about how right now we're all called to be both death doulas and birth doulas at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
Like in the world, with this humanity and earth, this what we can step into here. And so I feel like that poem, and then you are just also like being present in this death doula space. I just linked that to the poem and where we're at, in the world so much. So
It's great. Yeah, there's very much within this soul work, I see that as a pattern that we have to keep moving. And then in the container work, when you get into sort of facilitating and weaving, that's a lot of what you're doing. The men do the work. You're just setting up sort of the structure and sort of setting the conditions that will help sort of urge them to let go more, right? Like things as simple as you can't have your phone for 5 days. Your partner back at home can have this emergency contact to call us. And that alone, even on the retreats that I lead, which are shorter, less immersive than what I'm talking about, for some men, just having their cell phone not available to them. Because they'll say, well, can't I just turn it off? No, you can't have access to it. because it could be that it's midnight and you're turning it on to, do something. And just that alone for some men is so powerful because it
Mm.
becomes such a weight of obligation for them, or addiction, or stress, or detachment from their feelings. They don't want to feel something in their normal life, so they just get on their phone and play a game or look at their stock portfolio or whatever. So I think in that way, that this sort of death rebirth, this ending, the doula beginning, so much of it is going on in, very meta ways with, our democracy being at risk, and a real ugliness being sort of celebrated within the civic sort of
Mm.
social realm. With that, though, is a lot of endings are happening in which there's an opportunity. But in the more micro level, I see it a lot. And I also, I've done some work with the School of Lost Borders, which is something that people listening, I would encourage them. Bill Plotkin of Animas Valley, it was actually Stephen Foster and Meredith, his wife, who were the co-founders at School of Lost Borders. They were the first mentors for Bill and his sort of taking depth psychology to nature and doing nature immersions. And I did a training with them last summer on the four shields of nature, which is sort of using the directions and the seasons, and how each direction corresponds to a season and part of day and the stages of life, for sort of a model to frame our interior work. For instance, the south is morning, it's the direction of summer, and it's the direction of the child. So it's very external, warm, outwardly faced. That's not really focused with inward turn. You move to the west, that's adolescence, that's autumn, that's midday. It's the direction of the psyche going into the shadow more. There's more to it. Than the north is the adult. It's the winter. It's night, fortitude, resilience, sort of building a home, so to speak. Seeing something through, right? And there's negative, overweight aspects to these directions. And then the east is it's the direction of spring, rebirth. So between the night of the north and adulthood and infancy, rebirth of the newborn in the east is the rebirth, the death and rebirth. And it's spring. It's it's the early morning of the sunrise. So those developmental movements, we're going in and out of them throughout our whole life. It's not like I'm just in the South when I was 8 years old. Sometimes a man who's very bogged down in the North and can't, just works, and it's got that 1,000-pound weight just wearing them down, and it's coming out in anger and isolation and loneliness. They need more of the South. The directions tether each other. So they need more of that inner child to come to life, that external, to go fish, or, to garden, or to be goofy and play with your nephew on the carpet with the toys. So that's sort of the idea. So I think there's a lot of that. So there's that, as you come around the north and to the east, and that death rebirth, there's a lot of that just very actively going on with ourselves in the world right now.
I can't help but think of and see the image of the medicine wheel.
Yeah,
Carrying,
it's an
you know?
emotion like a wheel. It's all an emotion.
Yeah. And something that was standing out to me that I would share too is, the example that you gave of like when you come into this sacred space, and, men and women too, right? Even though you're working with men, like women too, if you detach them from their cell phones for 5 days, they're going to have an inner experience,
Yeah,
especially this day and age. But either way, what I want to add to that too is like, and as depth psychologist and psychotherapist and somebody who's been space holder, I fully believe and bring intention into any healing work. We are creating sacred space. We are creating a sacred container, and just trusting. And I've done it long enough to trust the process that just by being intentional and setting that sacred time, space, container, energetically speaking, you allow for something deeper to happen. So I
absolutely.
really want to speak to that too. Yeah.
Yeah, no. I mean, it's an interesting. I've got a lot of men I've worked with here who are now taking the next step. We're doing one of these large rites of passage emergence here in September. It's really an exciting moment. So a lot of the men I've been working locally with, there have been some who've gone to earlier ones in Arizona and Texas, British Columbia, and now are in the leadership of us putting on this one. But now that I have a lot of guys that I know who are signing up, and to see this sort of the psychological, and I do mixed gender work as well, which has been wonderful. I just do more men's work, but to see this sort of this tango of the soul, the way I put it is, of course, it's mystery around it, but the soul is drawn to that container. But then the ego is like, wait, hold on, like you're going to be asking me to be subverted, to take a back seat here, and it's a bit of this challenge. invariably we always had a handful of men that cancel in the last week or two. Some are legitimate, work, family, but some, and I did this years ago when I started to first sort of be drawn to this work, but wasn't ready. I had a time where I was on my way to a silent retreat in New Mexico, and I turned around. I made up some excuse. I just couldn't do it.
Mhm.
Now looking back, I just didn't want to relinquish the wall of protection.
Yeah.
And so it does require to enter into that sacred container space, trust and sort of a jumping off of a cliff. But I've almost always seen such beautiful consequence, or
Yes.
result. And it's just that simple sometimes. So it's just to get in the car and go, even though, and I've had some really powerful experiences. There was a guy that I know here who has a motorcycle as part of what he loves, and he rode his motorcycle all the way out to Arizona to do and was very bothered by one of the things that every man was asked to bring on this. He had a friend that was doing it as well, and he was going to leave. He rode his motorcycle like a day and a half from Oklahoma all the way, and was going to leave because he was bothered by, why do they want us to bring this? And he
Mm.
was saying to his friend, and my friend, our future friend, was like, "What is wrong with you? Stop." This is when men being this way is helpful to be like, "Shut up, you're doing this." And one of the good uses. And not only did he have like a totally transformative experience, he agreed or volunteered for a prominent role in the ritual that involved all the men bringing
That thing.
that thing. So the thing that he was most bothered by, that he was going to leave on, he ended up volunteering for a pivotal role in the sort of sacred use of that
Yeah.
object.
Yeah. It reminds me of honestly like being trained in a depth world. And of course, there's other things that you can compare it to, but it's really turning towards which Robin and I talk about a lot on here. It's like the willingness to turn toward, whether it's turning toward pain or turning toward the unknown, curiosity, fear, the willingness to turn toward is what opens that next step into stepping from ordinary to extraordinary, like
Yeah.
stepping into the sacred space. And so I agree completely. People who take that step, whether it's showing up for a therapy session or, a mentorship program or a retreat, or even going for a walk, if that's where you're starting,
Yeah.
it's taking that first step, really turning toward turning in.
It's all there waiting for us. The
Yeah.
interior landscape of a lot of gold is there. And it's so fascinating how we can get turned away and distracted. I like the idea that we can often become orphans to those parts of ourselves, even though we're carrying it all around. And
Mhm.
it often is active and animating the decisions we're making, sabotaging things that, our plans. So, yeah, just the ways in which to turn in. I do have a poem, another one I could read that I'm thinking of as I'm thinking back to a little bit about, the end of life interest. I'm also around a lot of elders in this work that is very valuable, grateful for the men who are in their last, 10 years of life, probably. And so I'm influenced by a lot of that and the diminishment that comes along with that, the physical diminishment. But they also have a lot of inner vitality because of the work they're doing. They have tremendous energy, right? So how do you sort of balance those things? So this is a poem I wrote. I've never posted this one. It's not in one of my collections, but it's called Eldering. The old man is happy, and yes, he is frail, and is confused much. Where did his dear dead wife wander off to? He wonders. And then he doesn't wonder at all, like turning a page that you didn't turn. He finds himself agaze, an empty fishbowl of a mind, seeing all the colors we cannot see in one perfect moment. His eyes foggy, and a memory now takes him backwards. He makes it this time. He can string it all back together, his string of beads of his dear life, his dear wife, his commanding hold on all the compartments that once thrived under his great engine, forcing down the rapids of time that his children fed well from, and that will bury him tomorrow with a smile and a pretty song.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, I feel like Andrew has really taken us on a full arc journey of life in this
Yes,
episode.
yes. So I have one question I'd like to ask, and that is for someone listening, whether it's a man or a woman, but maybe especially a man, just because you do so much men's work, if that inner space of self feels a little bit scary to be in, whether that's due to, shame or just whatever it is. And so then maybe the sense of a container that might offer a breaking open or, where you can't escape that self is also scary. What would you say to them?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think what I've found in myself, and then one of the benefits, of course, in getting in close community, both whether it's all genders, but particularly with men only, is realizing how common these struggles and fears are once men start talking. The first prompt, we use prompts in counsel, in the way of counsel, and the first prompt, that first counsel you have on the men's rights, when you first go sit down in the evening, you have a lantern and you're out in a field, the 5 or 6 of you, is what we call an I am counsel. And you just go around, I am a father, I am a black man. And then it starts to go a little deeper. I am a man who was abused by my father. It starts to go, and that is one of the more powerful prompts because I think a lot of men enter in guarded with, I'm so uniquely lost, I mean, particularly men who, on the material, external parts of their lives, have a lot. They have a good job and economic resources and a marriage that's stable or whatever. The things that society tells you should be more than enough. What's wrong with you? You have all that you would ever want. And for those men who are still lonely, and of course, because maybe they've really estranged their interior life from where they're putting all their energy. That's not to make them feel bad or to, so of course you feel lonely. You've been putting all of your work and all your tender, beautiful energy and force and strength into the external world that never will fully be able to validate what's precious about you. It's never going to work. Even when it does work. I mean, Tom Brady talks about that. Here's, one of the greatest quarterbacks, what happens after Super Bowl number 3? It's not worth it unless he wins Super Bowl number 4. So this is someone achieving at the highest levels of what our culture says should make you happy. So a lot of those men who sort of don't feel that they are entitled to have problems, to feel alone, to have anger, to have things they're sad about that they don't think they can handle, that they won't survive. I think a lot of men are afraid that they won't survive coming into contact with their inner emotions. It's so overwhelming how it feels. Maybe some of that is also through the modeling they got or didn't get from the men in their life, their fathers, grandfathers, coaches, mentors. And then when you do the mixed gender work, that's where it's really powerful. I mean, not to be too stereotypical, but in a way that's, that's validating of women. Women have things biologically that prepare them that force suffering on them, namely getting their period when they're a girl. Joseph Campbell found in his work on initiation rites in more than one culture, which is my favorite part of this fact. So it wasn't just one culture. In more than one separate cultures, he studied initiation rites, that in the boys' initiation rites, they had a wounding ceremony of sometimes pretty severe forms. That the word they used for the wounding ceremony in the rites was the same word in the indigenous tongue for menstruation. They were going to be intentionally, using a ceremony to provide a menstruation type of wounding onto the boy, not only to sort of tame their ego, right, and bring some humility, but also to help them start learning how to suffer. Because a boy, a masculine biological human that doesn't learn how to suffer is violent. Because their inability to suffer is what turns into violence. They have to do something with the energy. Either that's violence of addiction, physical or sexual violence towards another. So I think these are just a lot of the things that men start to discover about themselves and each other. And there's so much more in common when you sit in a circle. You're like, wow. And all it was, the one thing that was holding you back was not putting yourself in a container, like Nicole was talking about, or a sacred space where that would then be shared safely, right? That's all it was. You were in this sort of isolation of not ever talking about it, not revealing it, only talking about the golf match or work, or things like, or your kids, which are all fine things to talk about and important things to talk about. So that's what I would say to the guy that I've never seen it go awry. I've never seen, the worst I've ever seen is maybe a guy doesn't get out of that work the degree of which he wanted to get out of it. I've always seen men get something out of it. That's probably the worst I've ever seen. Nothing bad happens. Just maybe it didn't, impact you. 90% of the men, when they change, you can see it in their eyes. I have one man, once he started doing this work, they 5 or 6, 7 months or a year would go by, and then, like maybe there was some opportunity to go to another retreat, and he would go to his wife and say, "Do you mind if?" And she's like, "Do it. Whatever's going on there is just having this effect on you, where you're that much more patient and that much more, there's just she's seeing it, you know." So I think that there's something special there, which is not, we're not reinventing the wheel. Women do this work. We do it in cross gender ways. But the thing at which we try to avoid, either you address it or it will address you.
Yeah.
Carl Jung said things along a similar lines, like it's not going away. You can sort of push it to the side, but either you go face it, and it ends up not being nearly as scary and terrifying as we imagine, and it's understandable why it's scary. I was once that guy, big time. So that's where the gold is. Another Joseph Campbell quote: "The cave you fear to enter, it holds the gold you seek."
Innermost cave that you're afraid of, right? Or whatever. I
Yeah.
know what you're saying. But I love that you brought in that other quote and idea, because the Jung quote is, what you resist persists.
Yes.
I just I want to say one of my gifts, and I say this humbly, is I really see soul thread and things in people that are of great meaning. Your work with men is of such great meaning in this world. So I'm so grateful that you have shared what you have today. I'm incredibly inspired by it, and I've learned from it, which is really neat. And a tiny plug, I'm sure you know Michael Mead's work if
Yeah.
you've
Oh,
done
yeah.
it.
Yeah. Mm.
But there's a book that keeps coming through, and I'm like, so I'm just going to tell you. I don't know if you've read it, and if you haven't, you'd be interested. I think it's just called the Psyche of the Adolescent, or the Adolescent Psyche,
Mm.
or something like that. But talks a lot about what you're talking about, as far as like the necessity for ritual in order for one to not only live a conscious life, but for life to not kind of like, gosh, how do I want to say it, try and say it as clear as I can. Basically, he says in that book that if we do not turn toward eventually, or if we do not create some kind of intentional ritual in our life, then life will initiate us. It's like, if we don't turn toward, then life will come find us. That hero's call will continue to knock, and
Oh,
it
yeah.
will get louder. So,
Yeah. It'll come. It'll come. What's the deposit? Cash its worth. Mead. So Mead and Robert Bly,
mhm.
who's no longer alive. Mead is the only one still alive of him, Robert Bly, and oh God, why am I forgetting? I'm so embarrassed. Anyway, he was a Jungian analyst.
Hillman.
Hillman, yeah. They were in the late 80s and 90s sort of doing this men's work on a large level. You can find talks they gave on YouTube that were audio only. But Mead's got it. There's an old African proverb that he quotes that, yeah, if you don't initiate the youth in the village, that they'll burn the village down just to feel its warmth. That's
Right.
the idea of like joining a gang for connection. You don't give them that opportunity. And a lot of the men's work we do is quite intimate. There's a lot of men getting very close and leaning on each other and trusting each other. And the role of the older men, pulling back the veil for the boys to say, hey, go off and be important, but understand these are the things that men will go through. And so when
Yeah.
you start to encounter them, particularly as you get older, remember us. We were your elders to explain this is normal. That's a lot of what I would say to back to Robin's question. It's normal. It's not a fuck up. Life's not easy. One of the 5 hard truths that we work with in the rites work is life is hard. It's difficult.
Mm.
Absolutely unfair things happen to people. And so a lot of times when you have this vacuum around the boy, I think when we do work with fathers, we just say model for them vulnerability with boundaries and age appropriateness, right? You don't necessarily tell your 5-year-old every problem, intimate detail you're having, not, but you expose more of that to them as they get older. And then also find your inner vitality. Jung was a big believer in this. Find your inner vitality, because the danger of the adult parent sort of foisting their unlived life on the child, like, pressuring them to pursue something that they didn't ever do or whatever. The antidote to that is to find it yourself and live it, even if it's something simple and on the weekends, and that your child knows about it. They may not understand it. They may not totally get it. They may even think it's sort of weird, but they say dad or mom has that inner vitality. And that's some of the best modeling. So a lot of men of this generation, and it's not to blame our fathers, I have way more resources at my disposal for self-care and for help and for wisdom accrual than my father ever had. Therapy and workshops and intensive outpatient, all these things that weren't even around. And if they were, the men of my dad's generation were not going to avail themselves of them. So they did the best they could. But a lot of men of my generation had this vacuum and void around. So they make these assumptions about, like what we were just saying. They just, they don't know what they don't know. And what they don't know is a lot of these peaks and valleys are the normative masculine experience. And there's nothing to
Yeah.
be ashamed about. But the more that you avoid it and hide it and just try to push it down the road, the sort of the hungrier it gets and the bigger and stronger it gets. And when it comes to cash its due, it can be more difficult to handle and work through than if you just face it. There's a lot of men and women there to carry and walk men through that process, men and women through that process. We're really trying to bring that masculine warrior archetype more in balance with lover and magician. And Rohr has the theory that when you get the warrior, lover, and the magician in good equanimity, that's when the king emerges as the benevolent authority, which men and women have that king archetype, right? Of to be fair and loving, but to create the boundary. Like, no, you can't go past this line. There's consequences. If you need to know the consequences for you that are just there. I'm not imposing them. And the women's work often, not always, is a little bit the opposite. There's obviously exceptions and stuff. So
I appreciate it so much, and I feel like we could talk to you all day. I mean, there's so many things that are coming
yeah,
up.
I'm obviously letting a lot out. I haven't talked about this stuff in a while.
I've really, really appreciated it, and I've resonated with so much of what you've shared. And I think that honestly, this episode will be such a gift to men that do listen.
I'm super grateful to be able to do it. I'm super grateful to my wife, who's the breadwinner in our marriage and enables me. We have an agreement that if she's tired working, she quits working, and I go back to the work world that I'm in, and that I was exposed to this and changed by it, and that I get to be working in it. And I'll just say to the men out there, or the people, women and men who love men, my entrance though into this world was going into that cave, you know. And I had plenty of years, and these are years of being in long-term recovery, really thinking that I knew myself and really thinking that I had done my work. And I hadn't. A lot of it was just up here where a lot of men are. I hadn't really gone down here below the neck. I hadn't gone down into the heart space, the healing space. And I finally was able and willing. And that's sort of the journey we go on with you, but that's the entrance. That's the doorway to it, is saying, I'm going to go get uncomfortable. Rohr's idea is that the descent, and a lot of my poetry has the descent. You got to go to get to the ascent, into the growth. We're an ascent culture. Go to the mountaintop, fly, achieve, pleasure, accumulate. And we want to avoid the winter, the decay. You got to go down into the basement to sort of deal with what's underneath that we're not looking at first, to sort of find that pathway through to the other side. So, and that's what I've learned. This is not stuff I've dreamed up or I've written a thesis about. This is what you just learn through going through the process with others.
Yeah. And the initiations of life.
Yeah.
Well, before we go, Andrew, I know you work with people in a few different ways, but I'm not sure which ways you're still active with. So could you just, if there's anyone did have that desire to work with you, what are the ways that you work with people today, currently?
Yeah. So I do spiritual companionship work, which is spiritual direction or being a life coach. Essentially, it's being a mentor. I still do that, mostly on Zoom. I do some in person. I do often once or twice a year have an offering. I've been doing more multi-gender offerings. We actually had a vision quest planned. Sometimes I'm a bit ambitious in how I plan things. So this was a little tricky in that we were going to be in the Muleshoe National Wildlife Refuge, which is way out in West Texas, in the middle of very flat deserty, but there's a beautiful winter bird migration that goes through there. You got to sort of hit it right. Anyway, we had one planned and need to reschedule it, but that's a vision quest, a 4 or 5 day vision quest offering that sometimes I do men's retreats So anyway, yeah, on my website, resentmentville.com, there's retreats and some individual work. And then I have organizations I'm affiliated with and that I'm just friends of, like the School of Lost Borders and others that I can refer people to offerings that they do.
Okay, thank you. And we'll put your website in the show notes too. So,
Great.
It was so wonderful to talk with you today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This has been beautiful. Appreciate it.
thank you for joining us.
Thank you for being with us today. If you feel called, follow the podcast wherever you listen and connect with us on Instagram or YouTube at sacred.conversations.podcast. And most of all, may you keep opening to yourself, to the mystery, and to the story within you that's still being written.